Good evening, and I would say welcome, but this is not a great night. Uh, but this is the Berean Coffee House. My name is Kevin Short. I'm a Christian philosopher of religion. This is a very impromptu discussion. I have no script. I have no plan. Well, I have a vague plan, but I wanted to talk tonight about the assassination of Charlie Kirk, who was a political activist strongly connected with the current Republican administration. And he apparently, I don't know much about the man, but I've seen videos here and there of him arguing conservative points on college campuses. Allegedly, he was largely responsible for some in Gen Z moving towards a more conservative position because he persuaded them. But I don't want to discuss this just in terms of Republicans and Democrats. And I'm afraid that's the way this story is going to be played out. Again, I don't really follow politics as closely as I did when I was younger. There was a time I was a talk radio addict, and had very, very strong political views, as most young people do. I tended to be more conservative, in part because growing up near Detroit, I saw Democratic policies as largely, quite frankly, a failure. And because I tended to be legalistic, strict constructionism, which is something I still held to, appealed to me. There for a while, I flirted with libertarianism, but because I'm a Christian, I found those two viewpoints to be at odds with one another, and so I focused on my Christian and Baptist views rather than trying to be a pure libertarian. As I've gotten older, though, I've gotten more moderate on the one hand, and conservatism has changed on the other. You don't hear too many conservatives talking about strict constructionism anymore, and it's rather difficult to argue that Trump is an advocate for the separation of powers. I'm a lot more Reagan than Trump. But I'm also not one of the anti-Trumpists, and I had some even larger concerns with the previous administration and with President Obama's administration, particularly in the way they handled some freedom of speech issues and the weaponization of the Department of Justice in recent years. I want to talk about instead how, yes, this is political, but it's not and shouldn't be a gotcha moment about parties. There have been a rising number of political assassination attempts and some successes, going back at least to when one of Bernie Sanders' supporters shot at a congressional softball team a few years ago. I believe that was during Obama's term. I'm a little less certain as I'm getting older. As you know, there were several isolated cases of senators being shot. I'm not going to discuss who and what their motives were because that's not what's important to me. We know that there were two attempted assassinations of President Trump while he was on the campaign trail, which was one of several things that influenced the way I voted. I came to the conclusion that God was going to put Mr. Trump back in office. Whether that is for the good of our country or for his judgment on this country is something that I am still unsure of. But I believe it is his plan. I don't believe God is wringing his hands up in heaven wondering what's happening that Trump is in office. nothing takes him by surprise and everything happens by his allowance. And now we have this. We've also had a lot of school shootings. A lot of people make this about the Second Amendment. Now, let me just note, because I don't hear this being said as much, when I was growing up, the statement that was always made about the Second Amendment was, the first thing a dictator does when he comes to power is disarm the populace. And so I've always tended to view those who were in favor of gun control with a lot of suspicion as a result. My general assumption is if somebody is strongly in favor of gun control, they're probably not a fan of many other freedoms as well. The point of the Second Amendment is to keep the government itself in check. And I'm not going into the debate, that was just the point as it was explained to me when I was growing up. As I get older, there are some common sense restrictions I can understand. I'm not completely against all licensings of gun owners, required safety training and a few things like that. It's some common sense measures, but I'm not necessarily in favor of bans. And I don't like redefining assault rifle to include something that's not a fully automatic. Which is what happened in the 90s with the assault rifle ban, because assault rifles were already illegal. But this isn't about the Second Amendment, because we didn't have mass shootings 50 years ago, 60 years ago, 70 years ago. This is new. It's something that's happened in the culture. It's not a matter of guns. It's not about party. It's not about the Second Amendment. It's about ending the social contract. Social contract theory, as I understand it, is a compromise. It allows people to form their own views on ethical issues and provides the most freedom for people to follow those beliefs. It was a compromise that came out in theory during conflicts between Protestants and Catholics, as a means of settling political issues with debate rather than with force. The key point of social contract is that it operates in a rules-based environment rather than in a force-based environment. That, by the way, is why something like the First Amendment and an absolutist view of freedom of speech is a necessary thing for a democratic order. Because if you use force to prevent speech, then whoever is in power can simply use those codes to maintain power and use force instead of argumentation. So if we take the policies, for example, in Europe, it ultimately doesn't matter if someone is or is not a Nazi when it comes to their freedom of speech laws, which I always find it interesting that their laws don't include communists as well as Nazis, since communism killed at least as many people as the Nazis did. But aside from that issue, the question isn't who is or who isn't a Nazi. The question in Germany is, who does the government think is a Nazi? Because the government gets to decide who to apply the laws to. That's why ultimately we got rid of our own equal time laws, because they were being enforced by administrations, and some administrations misused that power. And it was felt that that was a dangerous thing to maintain. Now everybody kind of wants to go back to the system that didn't work, where it was being abused by various presidents. Do you really want Trump or Richard Nixon having the Same power that you would give to Obama or Biden, or vice versa. No, an absolutist view of freedom of speech is necessary in order to be able to maintain a debate. And I will talk at some point about freedom of speech because I think there are some intricacies there that need to be dealt with because, quite frankly, I think we misdefine speech today. But rather than debate with Charlie Kirk, somebody chose instead to use force and assassinate him. And that is the kind of poison that a social contract cannot survive. If we don't reject violence as a society, as a means of solving political disagreements, then we cannot be a free society. And if we cannot speak civilly and focus on argumentation rather than feelings, then we are going to drive people to using force rather than argumentation to settle political disputes. And this ultimately comes down to our virtues. As many of you know, I did my dissertation answering New Atheist, arguments against Christianity from Old Testament slave codes. My argument was that God may have good reason for regulating rather than abolishing slavery in certain circumstances. I use Matthew 19 as it was used by emancipationists before the Civil War as an argument, or drew on that as one potential reason why. And my argument was that human beings may not have had the virtues to maintain a free society before the time of Christ and until the church had taken sufficient root in the culture. And even though the church has often been weaker in the West than we give it credit for, at the least, Christian virtues were given lip service for quite a while, particularly, I'm sure, by the common folk. As one book has recently noted, a couple of years ago, Christianity has built our modern Western cultural ethic, and it is diametrically opposed to the uber predators such as Greece or Rome. And in Greece and Rome, democracies were considered to be failed systems. And if you read why Plato thought that democracy was a failure in the Republic, well, it looks a lot like our day. As we are living in a post-Christian society, the virtues necessary to maintain a democracy are sadly being lost. So what do? Well, I'm not sure at this point America can be saved as an institution. God has been known to take down nations at the peak of their power. As Christians, we should pray for our country. And for those atheists who complain about Christians offering prayers, might I remind you that in our views, prayer is one of the most powerful things in the universe. Because it brings us in connection with God Himself, the ruler of all things. But I think we're seeing Romans 1 in action here. Dr. John MacArthur, a few years ago, preached a sermon in which he noted from Romans 1 that first comes a sexual revolution, then comes a homosexual revolution, and then comes madness. Welcome to the madness. Can we come back? I don't know. Here's what I do know, though. In hard times, our only hope is to cling to Christ. We're not going to be able to solve this problem by doing politics as usual. It's going to require a shift in the culture, a shift that maybe it will happen, maybe it won't. It's going to require us to clean our own houses first. The churches can't operate and function well if they're merely social clubs. And I hope at least that this will change your way of viewing this. Instead of looking at this as Democrats versus Republicans and trying to track who's winning and trying to use violence as some kind of new sporting card, and who's more violent and which group produces more violent extremists. I don't care. It's the social contract itself that is under attack. And it is under attack because the Christian influence on the culture has waned. And if we want to turn things around, we can't do it by focusing on the ballot box. We have to focus on the human heart instead. And I think that's how we need to think about it and how we need to speak about it. So, a little rambling maybe, but this has been the Berean Coffee House. I'm sure you haven't enjoyed this one, but I hope it's at least a little bit helpful. Thank you. Bye.